All right. Thank you, everybody. Good to be here this afternoon. Good to see all of you. So yes, this is a critical topic, as I'm sure all of you can agree. Not everybody agrees, but the tiny few that don't are very foolish, I think it's fair to say. And to give you a sense of just how critical, I ran across a statistic recently. Accenture estimates the industrial Internet of Things could add 14.2 trillion to the global economy by 2030. So 14.2 trillion is sort of an impossible number to conceive. I think that's something like 12 Jeff Bezos, which is the plural of Bezos. To start off, I'm going to turn to you, Adam and Patrick. When we talk about securing the Internet of Things, give us a sense of, first, the context. Like, what really are we talking about in terms, in a broad way, of the risk and also the challenge?
So to outline the perspective of a large global manufacturer like Samsung, well, Samsung is a global manufacturer producing and shipping to the market like 1.5 million devices a day, electronic devices, which makes like over 500 million of devices yearly. So achieving such a volume and such a throughput wouldn't be possible without employing industrial IoT enabling technologies. Even having multiple factories around the world, that wouldn't be possible. So industrial IoT is inevitable. On the other hand, IIoT technologies are significantly increasing the potential attack surfaces and may bring some vulnerabilities to the entire manufacturing chain. And if exploited, that can bring really significant damage to our business. So starting with like somebody attacking the IoT devices, sensors, or industrial control systems, they may cause the slowdown of manufacturing process or even downtime, which easily turn into hundreds of thousands of dollars for a few hours downtime only. Tampering with safety instrumented systems may lead to some injuries or deaths or environmental disasters. Another important aspect is stealing the trade secrets, manufacturing secrets. Let's take semiconductor manufacturing. You know, these technologies like nanometer semiconductor manufacturing or 4 or 5 layers manufacturing, developing such technology costs like hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. So imagine competitors stealing this information. This may completely ruin the business or at least change the landscape of the global market. And last but not least, compromising the privacy of the personal data or our vendors' data or customers' data may ruin our trust, brand reputation, and lead to some serious legal or financial consequences in the long term.
Okay, Patrick number 2. I'm Patrick 1, he's Patrick 2.
Great name, by the way.
Thank you.
So building on what Adam said, I think, you know, it sounds like shipping a lot of devices, 1.5 million per day. I think what we worry about are the equipment that's already out there that's being retrofit. So you've got these devices that weren't built with the idea that they would be put on a network one day. And so they have a lot of insecurities built into them. A lot of the security controls assume that they're only connected somewhere locally versus the entire internet. A lot of the devices are underpowered too. So if you think about modern security protocols that you'd like to employ, encryption, protecting data in transit, they don't have the horsepower to do that, nor are they very updatable. So you have devices, and that's typically how these things get exploited. So you heard some mentions earlier of worms. A lot of these vulnerabilities were known and patches were out there, but it's very difficult when you have this proliferation of devices. I think some of the estimates next year are 20 billion plus devices. Sounds like a doubling from what it is today. It's very difficult to stay on top of that from a patching mechanism. Additionally, I think we heard some comments earlier about insurance and liability. One of the things that our customers are worried about is what happens if their devices are commandeered and they're attacking other businesses. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how can we protect these devices, not just to protect internal threats, but also being used externally. From a threat perspective, I think we kind of break them into sensors and things that act on things. And so the scariest threats that we worry about and our customers worry about are those that can affect both. So being able to, you've probably all heard of Stuxnet, being able to take control of some device, but also mask the sensor that's sending information out as a fail-safe. So that combination from a physical security perspective is very scary. From an economic perspective, I think it's more around the sensors. If someone's able to manipulate your data, you're acting on that. That data is how you're driving your business decisions. And so if someone can change that or someone can expose that, that's a very scary proposition. I think the thing to keep in mind from a threat mitigation perspective is that a lot of the techniques to mitigate these threats are not new. These are pretty established security practices. They need to be deployed in different mechanisms and different operational modes, but a lot of this is not new. And so I think keeping that in mind as companies look to put these in the field is really critical.
So, Adam, you touched on something that I think we need to spend some time talking about. You probably have heard a little bit about it, and that is the risk, the cyber risk in terms of infrastructure, and that meeting with the Internet of Things. So this is the whole, cyber D-Day that former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta used to talk about. And we actually kind of got a glimpse of it 2 years ago in Ukraine when, because of a remote attack, power was cut off in the month of December for a limited period of time. And this was a sort of a historic thing. This was an Internet of Things attack with a geopolitical component that had real-world consequences, and it shut off power. So I want to go to really the entire panel here. When you look specifically at infrastructure, because when we talk about security in the Internet of Things, that's the area that is, I think, sort of the most critical. Where is infrastructure the most vulnerable, and what needs to happen like day one immediately? And I'll throw that out to anybody that wants to pick it up. You're hesitating. Okay.
I think the answer is it's vulnerable everywhere. It really is. But if you look at the way IT has developed over the last sort of 25 years, it's been quite a constant evolution. So 25 years ago, we were dealing with mainframes. Everything was in one box. It was rather easy. Then we had client-server technology. Then we had things like Corba, Java 2 Enterprise Edition, distributed objects. And now we've really gone to the other end of this scale, where we've got objects everywhere, rather small but very powerful computing objects, of course. Often we don't know where they are, and that's part of the design philosophy. What is perhaps a bit worrying is that we are still basing our control frameworks on ideas that were born in the mainframe area. And there's a fundamental mismatch. Yeah? In many ways, it's doomed to failure. And I think there are three big things which are affecting today's networks, and three big reasons why we cannot really cope with the security. One is very high scalability, as we've seen. So we're not talking about millions of objects, we're talking about billions of objects. Secondly is short time to market, which means that all the processes have to go much faster, and security is not a fast process. And thirdly, we have strong cost drivers. If you put those three things together, it indicates that we've really got to look at things in a totally different way in order to get the degree of control we want over our networks. Having said that, we can't forget the legacy systems. Yeah, they're still there. And as someone who used to actually be employed to sort of hack into systems, you always look for problems at interfaces. So when you've got an interface between an old technology and a new one, you're almost guaranteed to find some weak points there because the paradigms don't match. So I really believe the weaknesses are everywhere. Perhaps the key to this is we need a way of doing security which is economically viable, which prioritizes things correctly, which doesn't cover everything, but which means that we are sure that at least we are taking care of the issues in a rational and prioritized order.
Okay.
Yes, yes, very much agree. In Cisco we are seeing the interesting phenomenon, which is we have the privilege to work with the most of the big, small, and mid-sized companies since many years, and we've been working with them, to secure the IT networks. Mm-hmm. And what we see now is that what we call OT networks or production networks, not traditional IT networks, they are becoming obviously enriched with the IP technology. They are getting connected to the world, and basically we see that the environment there is very, very chaotic, very, very driven by the single events, and putting basic design and security practices in this environment will help a lot.
Okay, so just the
help.
basics. Just you got to
very basic.
No one understands that out there. There's just just tons of unsecured little devices, and they all need just the same basic cybersecurity things that we have on the computers we'll use.
Yeah, obviously that will not solve the entire problem, but that will help a lot already, right? If you think about it, usually, manufacturing machine almost by accident has been IP enabled, and nobody really understands what are the consequences of that. And the second little point is that due to the scalability and all the previous points, it's really, really important that network is going to be, security aware. Network is going to react, and network is going to help during the attacks. It's equally important, like putting the emphasis on the end device.
Okay, so I think that one of the things that scares me most about the conversation that people have been having about securing the Internet of Things is there's a lot of different interpretations of what infrastructure is, and I think that there's not enough understanding of the geopolitical dimensions of this. And so, Bonnie, I'll turn to you for an example of that. Consider in July of last year in Finland, as Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin were ready to have a historic bilateral, very closed-door meeting. A couple of days before, there was a massive attack on a variety of Internet of Things connected devices, many of which were closed-circuit security cameras in areas that were surrounding where the meeting was taking place and throughout Finland. So basically, as two world leaders emerge from the stage, and then they start talking and debriefing people around them, and then those people debrief. Potentially, you could, if you had gained control or access to one of those closed-circuit devices or another aspect of the Internet of Things in Finland, you could develop intelligence that you wouldn't normally have. Guess where that attack originated? Shout out if you have a guess. China. Yeah. So, Bonnie, let me turn to you. Do you feel like folks appreciate the new geopolitical dimension of Internet of Things vulnerability? And then I want to get to the question of 5G and bandwidth, because that ties directly also to China.
I think what we're asking people to do is to conceive the inconceivable. Everything is vulnerable, and you can't protect everything. There simply aren't enough resources. There's no way to protect everything to the same level. And you don't know where the next attack is coming from or why. I recently got back from New York, where I was meeting with a group of chartered professional accountants, and they had recently been targeted in their software, which was commonly used throughout the US for the chartered professional community in accounting, was targeted by Russia. And they couldn't figure out for the life of them why they were being targeted. And so if you don't even know why you are the target of an attack, how do you prepare yourself to prepare for it? And I think that's part of the challenge, is you don't know where it's coming from, or it could be an extension of an attack on another group or entity, facility, infrastructure. And it's really almost impossible to expect companies or entities to be able to prepare for everything. It's almost a asymmetric type environment where you can only do what you can do. And at the same time, the penalties and the regulations and the requirements and the standards are increasing to an almost impossible level. So this is really becoming quite concerning, and with 5G, it will only expand in terms of complexity. For example, the attack on the Abqaiq plant and the Khurais oil fields in Saudi Arabia, which was a drone attack from Yemen, that attacked to directly their financial strong point, which was the Aramco facilities. That was a financial targeting of the core of Saudi funding. Whereas other attacks, like the professional accountants, why? There was no clear answer.
Right. So in a little while, I'm going to turn to you all, and we're going to have microphones coming out. And if you have questions, I'll be looking for you to raise your hand and wave. And if you're shy, no worries. But it's good to have courageous people, and the world loves courageous folks. And we had an opportunity to ask questions of this panel. So please start thinking of questions, and I'll look out at some point, and I hope to see some hands raised. But in the meantime, Bonnie, I want to stick with you for a second, because this question of 5G is a huge one right now. The United States is grappling with it. Bottom line. China produces 5G equipment that is going to be incredibly market dominant just on a cost basis. You see a lot of different, both private entities around the world and also potentially governments around the world racing to go and adopt it. What is the best way to mitigate the potential risks of large-scale adoption of 5G technology? And I'll send that to you as well, Adam.
I think a lot of it also depends on geography. If you look at Canada as an example right now, excuse me, Huawei has invested heavily into the Canadian telco environment in Canada, and right now is prepared to provide connectivity to about 70 northernmost communities in Canada that don't have reasonable connectivity at this time. The Canadian telcos can't provide that kind of connectivity at a reasonable price, yet they don't want Huawei to have the monopoly in the Arctic, and that is concerning as well, that a foreign telco would potentially have a monopoly on an Arctic region and 70 communities, for example. And so, but at the same time, the geography matters because Canada is so large, and we need cheap components, and yet there's a concern. And so if you look at the difficulty of geography, we are positioned between the US and China in terms of trade. And this puts us in a very difficult position right now, which is not easily solved. And Canada has not been one of the first countries to be proactive on 5G. We're getting there, but we're certainly not anywhere near where the UK is right now, or Australia, or, of course, China. So this puts us at a bit of a disadvantage in trying to position between different sides, whereas geography, for example, of India may actually benefit from a very high level of competition between China and the US, and may be able to benefit from both and even accelerate the competition to an even higher level.
So it sounds like we haven't dealt with the mitigation factor, how to mitigate that, the effect of Chinese 5G equipment flooding the market in Canada. But I want to go to you, Adam, with the same question. Also, Steve, because you had something to contribute. And I know that the UK has put out, different entities in the UK put out a variety of papers on that question of how to mitigate the risks of the wide-scale adoption of Chinese 5G equipment. And it's a complicated answer, but there is an answer. So, Adam, I'll turn to you first.
One way to mitigate this risk is probably having a multi-stakeholders dialogues. So the regulators should invite manufacturers, standardization bodies, academia, and talk about the risks, identify the areas of threats, and jointly talk about how to address them. The other way is, of course, diversification of the vendors, providers, so not rely on a single vendor. Well, there is yet another aspect which is actually hard to capture, which is working with the trusted vendors. But trust is really hard to measure, and it's something that develops over time. So it requires time and working together to develop the trust. And then also putting some formal frameworks, like some security standards in place, and possibly even some sort of certification mechanisms, tool sets, and regimes to make sure that all the elements of the critical infrastructure goes through these regimes, and when certified, can become the part of critical infrastructure.
Yeah, maybe, look, one of the difficult things with 5G is the statement of the problem. You actually just said something very interesting. I think you said the risk was widespread adoption of Chinese technology. The Chinese might not agree with that. I mean, the problem I have in this debate is that it tends to mix three separate things. One is trade policy, one is intelligence and state-sponsored attacks, and the third is security. And I think it's very important to, in any debate, to say what risk we are trying to mitigate. But let me take the third. If you take standard cybersecurity, I sometimes think that with this evolution we've had over the years, we forget the old stuff, and it's very good stuff. And I think you said it in a different way, but 20 years ago, we were very big into the concept of security architecture. And one of the biggest, old techniques, which is still one of the most powerful ones, is defense in depth. In other words, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. So you don't set up a whole national infrastructure based on any provider. You mix them, yeah? So if one goes wrong, that you can fall back on another. So I think using standard techniques in the right way will go a long way. Another thing which I think people forget sometimes is that security is not just about technology. It's about people, process, and technology. And the process side in 5G will be extremely important, especially when we consider that the 5G specifications have not converged. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, we're building a house on the sand because they could change and they will change. Mm-hmm. And some of the stuff in 5G is incredibly complex, like software-defined networking and network functional virtualization. Yeah. I mean, this is really complex stuff. So I do agree with my colleague, but I think a lot of it is apply the principles that we've known and learned over the years well. Make sure you understand what you're doing. So do the simple stuff first, and then we can build to more complex things like certification later. But at the end of the day, you've also got to think, when rolling out new technologies, of course you've got the business case, but you've got to balance that against the level of risk you're taking. And there's a lot of risk in 5G at the moment.
Yeah, let me just put a little bit of the technical flavor into this. So first of all, we have to realize that 5G architecture is much more distributed than the previous version. So because of that fact, it's more difficult to make it secure. But I'm very glad that you mentioned strange acronyms like software-defined network and network function virtualization. Yes, it is very complex, and I will not attempt to explain this now. But what I'm going to say is that this is actually great opportunity for us because this is unique control point for us, through which we can make those networks much more secure. Mm-hmm. Okay, so to your point, Adam, my advice would be build those networks in as much as possible open way. Decouple radio part and IP part, make it virtual, and therefore make it much more secure. And there are credible ways to do it.
Adam, you have something? Sorry, Patrick.
Yeah, I'd like to add one thing. So I think thinking about 5G is a way to connect devices, and I think we've seen a shift of people from working in an office to working mobile and remote. And we've seen a shift also from trusting the network that you're on to not trusting it. And every time you're connecting to a resource, you're identifying yourself. And so I think a lot of those same principles can be applied here. When I used to do penetration testing, I'd be brought into a conference room inside a bank, and they would say, have at it. That was a lot easier when I was inside the network and I was trusted. When you're outside and you're relying on a zero trust environment, it becomes a lot more difficult. And I think we need to think about that as layering encryption, to Steve's point, on top of the protocol that is connecting us.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I can tell you right now, I've spent a little bit of time talking about this with folks in the national security community in the United States, and the NSA is very concerned about it. And they're kind of following what Europe is doing a little bit, which is on a governmental level, spending time figuring out how to quarantine essential functions away from networks that might be very vulnerable. So what that tells you is that there's actually a hidden cost to this very cheap stuff, and it's a security cost, and right now it's being borne by governments, but that's not something that's been calculated. And I wonder if in the future we're going to see a move to allow private entities that are relying on networks that have largely insecure equipment to undertake some of that, those procedures themselves to bring things up to a standard, to do the patching, et cetera, so that you can operate that equipment in a way that's more safe, that's a little bit safer. But that also requires a certain amount of willingness to share information. So this is something that we were all talking about a little while ago. going back years and years and years, when you talk to anybody about how to better just improve cyber hygiene everywhere, every framework you could find would say, well, we just need more cyber information sharing. We definitely have to have better cyber information sharing among all of these different entities. And when everybody's on the same page, you're going to realize an improved level of security universally. So I want to turn to you, Bonnie, because you have some experience in this. Despite that mantra being so often repeated, I don't feel like cyber information sharing or threat sharing has improved so much in the last 4 years, but that might just be my perception. What's a way forward in that area, particularly when it comes to the Internet of Things, which is obviously going to be just as vulnerable for all of these different entities, just as much of a point of sensitivity, but also exponentially larger?
Sharing threat information, excuse me, and information about your systems depends on the sector and it depends on your business. For example, recently, the metals and mining community were getting hit in succession, but they weren't sharing the information with each other because the value of their organizations and their operations was such that were it to become public or even shared among the community itself of the minings and metals companies, that the others would just move in and grab your market share. And your stock would go down, and it would be devastating. And so it was better just not to share anything. But after a number of attacks where they were getting hit in succession, and they knew they were getting hit in succession with the same methodology and the same attacks, it became clear that something had to be done to get over that hurdle or over that disincentive to sharing the information, at least amongst themselves, not necessarily involving government or more regulation, more laws, penalties, but something had to be done. And so with our organization, we run an agile network of security professionals and professional associations globally. We don't work that much with private sector companies, but in this one instance, they came to us for a solution. How do we share in an agile way that will benefit all of us and not see us eating our own market share every time we get attacked? And so we were able to provide them with a model that they could come together and share the funding and create an ISAC amongst the metals and mining community in Canada. It took off very quickly and has been very successful. And the footprint has expanded globally. So it depends on the sector.
Very quickly, can you? What is an ISAC for those of you that might not be familiar?
An information sharing center for threats. So it's they collect the data and share it amongst themselves in a secure manner. And that way they can prevent the attacks from continuing on down in a domino fashion and yet keep it amongst themselves where possible so as not to affect share or business operations.
So did they involve the government in that?
Not necessarily, no. This was set up with the companies themselves, and they had a cost-sharing model and set up the center, and very, very successful.
So I'm like wondering if I were a government legislator or an MP, would I want these ISACs to share information with me? It seems like I would, but I also wouldn't want to create an environment where they were afraid to share with each other because of the obligation to share with me. So that seems like a kind of difficult hurdle to overcome. I'll turn to you, Patrick, because you also have some experience in this. Brokering exchanges between private entities that do want to share perhaps vulnerability information with each other are going to be nervous about sharing it outside, but maybe probably should share it with different governmental entities, depending.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we deal with at Cloudflare, we're the recipient for our customers of a lot of attacks. And so we see pretty much everything out there. We see about 10 million requests per second, 200 cities around the world.
Bragging.
I'm sorry?
That's bragging.
Yeah, sorry. And so, we see all sorts of different attacks. And so we like to think of it from a herd immunity perspective. So we're sharing data through technology anonymously to protect if one site gets attacked, we can learn something that protects another site. In some cases, though, it kind of goes beyond that. And so we see some really sophisticated nation-state level attacks where companies will be suffering from these attacks, and we'll have reach out from law enforcement, and they'd say, hey, we'd love to learn some more about this, and could you make an introduction for us, because we feel we can help, and we feel we can help this entity that suffered a loss, as well as other companies that may be facing similar things. And so I think we see it as our trust and safety team as a way to connect industry and government to make the world safer for everyone.
Okay, and I want to go to Steve with this too because he has a point on it. But Patrick, I want to stick with you for a second. When you broker these different relationships, do the private entities, do they ever experience some loss, some problem in beginning to have a relationship with government in disclosing these vulnerabilities? Is there an actual need for them to be concerned, or is it mostly like imaginary?
So from the ones I've been involved in, they haven't really experienced a loss, I think, and it's totally their choice. And so it's made, the law enforcement request is made very optionally and said, we would like to help. We have resources at our disposal. Here's how we've helped in the past. Would you be willing to introduce us? Mm-hmm. And it's up to the company that's been attacked to take that help or not take that help. And oftentimes it's been an investigation that they've started initially internally, and it's really helped expedite their request. So I haven't really seen it hurt, really just help from my experience.
Yeah, so and that also speaks to the importance of strong governmental structures and open government and democratic foundations in securing things, because if your government runs the FSB, you have no choice but to share your cyber information with them because they're getting it anyway. So let me take to you, Steve.
Yeah, let me add a different dimension to this. So at NISA, our core business is in fact helping member states and private sector to share information. And my take on this would be, it's no good just sharing information. There's a hell of a lot of information out there, and sharing everything doesn't get you anywhere. You just end up in data overload. So I would say the trick is to share the right information at the right time with the right person for a specific purpose. And so if I were, on the basis of what ANISA has learned, give advice to the audience in terms of information sharing, know what information you need, and it's not just indicators of compromise and vulnerabilities, it's the whole panoply of information. Know how you're going to use it, and know your restrictions, because most people, even when it comes down to pure IOCs, they simply do not have the capacity to handle these things. So a sensible approach in which you know what you're looking for, you know how you're going to use it, you know what your limitations are in order to be able to cope with the information, goes a long way, I think.
That's right.
Yes, one thing which we have to realize is that all those things are happening in real time. The scale is massive, and they are having potentially devastating effect. So, although this is what you've been just discussing is, of course, incredibly important. What I would suggest is that modern security architecture needs to be, online connected to some knowledge-based real time. Mm-hmm. This devices needs to be updated with the new information real time. They need to talk to each other. They need to leverage machine learning techniques in order to make the environment secure. We have the group of the people in my company which is monitoring internet traffic. They are seeing new threats. They are seeing many new threats every day. They are seeing hundreds of attacks every day, and they can, update with this new information devices across the globe almost real time. Mm-hmm. And this is the solution to those problems. It has to be much, much more robust than people sharing information hours or days after accident.
Yeah, you're almost describing a situation, and I get that this can probably happen internally at Cisco, where everybody is on almost like the same cloud. And when I talk, and that's not going to happen across all of industry, but something like it can happen in a smaller way. But it sort of speaks to this question of what is the critical information that needs to be shared. So anomaly detection and anomaly by definition is something that's a departure for the norm, and so that's a piece of information that's potentially shareable. But there's other pieces of information that would be incredibly critical that probably aren't shared, such as the number of different systems out there that aren't up to date on vulnerabilities in the National Vulnerabilities Database. And this is a huge issue for particularly municipalities that are running schools and hospitals and basically have IT sitting on desks that have old versions of Windows that aren't up to date. And this is how you see ransomware like knock down all of Baltimore. So I wonder, how do we facilitate better information sharing around things that are truly of public interest, but also incredibly sensitive? Bonnie, how difficult is that conversation to have?
Very difficult. GDPR is a good example. Since the GDPR penalties came in, there was such a fear because they are so incredibly high, especially for smaller companies, that there was actually over-reporting. Something would happen in the system, you weren't sure if you were actually attacked or if there was an incident that you had to report, so companies were reporting just in case so that they wouldn't get hit with the penalties. And so this mass over-reporting actually is a problem, and not just with GDPR, but potentially all the other breach and reporting regulations, which in the US there's at least 50 at this time and many, many more coming down the track. So the fear of being hit with penalties and the over-reporting, let's hope that the GDPR reporting center doesn't become a target, because then everybody's vulnerabilities will be exposed potentially. That's creating a holy grail in a certain sense, and may add to what was supposed to be a solution.
Patrick, did you have something? No? No? Okay. So I want to remind everybody that if you feel like asking a question, I'm having a little trouble seeing, but I can kind of see, and also you can stand and we'll get microphones out to you if that's something that you would like. Because we've got about 14 or so minutes left, and this is a great opportunity to engage a panel of experts on an issue that I think is critical to the way we're all going to live in the years ahead. But let me turn very quickly to Steve, your INSA has put out I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, has put out a new paper on basic practices for securing the Internet of Things. I wonder if you could tell us what are the most important points from that, the top two.
Yeah, sure. But perhaps let me preface it with some remarks on IoT in general, otherwise it will be a bit meaningless. So I already mentioned these three big factors of very high scalability, short-term to market, and strong cost drivers. I would say that what changes in the IoT world is not the threats. The threats are remarkably constant. What changes are the vulnerabilities and our ability to be able to control these devices. And it turns out that our ability to do so is rather low. Don't forget that these devices are also mobile, so they can be part of the time in the office environment, part of the time at home. And I don't agree when people say that things like a toothbrush is a low-risk object, because if that toothbrush can talk to your PC and your PC is logged into your office environment, it's game over. Right. So this is not true that the home environment is low risk, yeah? Which brings me on to another subject, which is context. So security is very context dependent, and then you ask yourself, how do you secure something like an Excel spreadsheet? It can run to keep your CDs correct at home, in which case the risk is very low, but it can control processes in the nuclear power plant. So how do you secure such a thing? If the model was to give a maximum security to it, it will cost a fortune, and I won't buy it at home. So context is very important. So IoT is an extremely complex world, and there is no magic solution. That's the first thing I would say, which comes back to this argument of people, process, technology. And you've got to mix all three, I think, to be able to control this correctly. So what came out of the study? Really nothing surprising. And it's a long list, so I'll just take you through some of the things.
Take us through the best one.
I'll take you through the best one. The best one. That's interesting. Let me have a look. Supply. I think the best one is supply chain. There's a whole range of things. Nothing here would supply you, but I think a very common theme which is coming up in security these days is nearly everything we are running is based on a complex supply chain. And unfortunately, I believe a lot of companies don't even really understand their supply chains. It's so complex, yeah? So securing the supply chain is absolutely fundamental. And last year, we saw the possibility of having, a hardware hack. Turns out it wasn't the case, if I remember correctly, but it was perfectly possible. So unless you control all the elements leading to your final project, you've got vulnerabilities there. And the second thing I'll introduce, which is introduced by this debate, is the concept of liability. Liability does not scale to the internet. Yeah, I mean, we heard it in the previous discussion of insurance. The losses are huge. So what do? Do we go to a sort of VAT model where we use a repartition key to, you know, to say that in the event of something, everyone pays a part? Or I don't know what we do, but certainly we have to rethink it out. And the one thing we don't want is to understand the supply chain and then put all the responsibility on the final component, because the thing which will happen is security won't go better, they'll just go out of business.
Right.
So that's the one I will put the emphasis on, because it's prevalent in almost all our discussions. The rest, I've been over a lot of them, they're standard information security. Again, what I would stress about today's security world is that it is so incredibly complex. You know, you've just got to prioritize what you know, go for the stuff that you can do at reasonable cost. Prioritization, you'll never cover everything. But that's like automobiles. We recognize that there are deaths due to automobiles, unfortunately, but we accept it because the value is so great. Right. So we've got to rebalance the opportunity risk equation for the future.
So one thing that I'm gathering from here and our previous discussion, as well as the previous discussion that happened on the stage, is that we yet don't have any good economic model for understanding the actual risks of cyber and security and how to price them from an insurance perspective and how to price them from a risk-reward calculus. And that creates a lot of problems, but you see it very clearly in the culture divide that exists, I think, just in tech in general, right? You've got like the startup community, lots of hotshot kids pushing out these brand new devices, pushing out a lot of new products. They need to get them to market. They need to get series funding very quickly. Everybody loves them. They're, you know, on the front of like Fast Company, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the cybersecurity community, which is represented by like folks that go to DEF CON. They tend to be a little older. They tend to be a little bit more angry because they have good advice. Everyone ignores them half the time. And so I think that this is like speaks to a larger and very real problem. Bonnie, how do we begin to price actual insecurity in these devices from an insurance perspective? The folks before us, the banking guy was like, yeah, I think it's a great idea. We should totally do that. But you had mentioned earlier that there's an emerging academic discipline to look at this. So where is that right now? What have they concluded?
Right. Cybersecurity Economics, so it's the study of economics specific to cybersecurity, has emerged. And there are currently about 150 academics globally working on this. And what has come out of this early findings of this new discipline is that cybersecurity does not act like traditional security. The cybersecurity and tech company space tends to operate more like monopolies rather than a market good. And that companies may actually be disincentivized to protecting the data because unlike other market goods, data within the cyberspace and in cybersecurity is your business advantage. It is your business. The data is the value. And so companies are reluctant to protect it too much because they need it themselves. And so this new discipline has been actually quite interesting, and I think springboarding off of it, it raises other questions, such as is risk management in a traditional sense, or even enterprise risk management, working within cybersecurity the way that traditional risk management does for other kinds of security? And I would argue that the answer is no. We have a number of examples of cases. For example, the Sony attack, risk acceptance didn't work for them. The company's employees had warned the executives, do not accept this risk. They did anyway, and the Sony employees are suing the company. Another example, Lafarge is currently in an appeal case right now in France. They had tried to manage the risk by paying a ransom to, it turns out, ISIS, and they were found guilty of crimes against humanity and terrorist financing because that money may have been used for the Bataclan attacks in Paris, even though there wasn't a clear monetary chain to prove it. And so that appeal is going on right now. The next hearing should be in November.
Patrick,
Yeah, I think building off what Bonnie said is very interesting. The Sony example where it was reported up. I think one of the shifts that we're seeing, and Steve and I were talking about this prior, is the reporting structure is changing, and so we're seeing CISOs increasingly reporting to CEOs, and so our CTO likes to talk about this. The incentive structures there are quite different, and I think that is bringing more awareness to those risks, and perhaps the CEO is given more information to act on it. So I think it's really interesting to potentially change the economics of those decisions.
And interestingly, if I could just add to that, one thing that is coming up very recently is that CEOs are now approaching the security side of the business to consult. And so instead of security trying to get that seat on the C-suite and get that voice at the table, because of recent events, CEOs are now looking to security more than they ever have.
Yeah, I would bet that the next CEO of Equifax, whoever he or she is, will be a lot more knowledgeable about fundamental cybersecurity. Is it like sort of a good example? But one of the other areas that I think CEOs of the future will probably be a lot more knowledgeable than folks today is machine learning and artificial intelligence. And it's an emerging field. We have a little bit of time left. And because it's so emerging, there's not a lot all of us can say about it yet. But it does have a particular potential application in cybersecurity and securing the Internet of Things in general. So Patrick, very briefly, in terms of what you've surveyed, is this a big potential breakthrough in terms of creating the security environment that you want, or is it right now mostly hype and not too much substance?
I think it's a necessity. There's just so much data that's out there that you really can't sift through it without machine learning. I mean, just the sheer amount of data that we're ingesting, we have to automatically look for these correlations. And so for companies also that are focused on data exfiltration, you need to have a system spot patterns. So if you think about some normal data access pattern, and to Bonnie's point, you don't want to lock this data down so tightly that it can't be used. Mm-hmm. You need to look for, what are the access patterns? What are the countries typically accessing this from this usernames, from these IP addresses? You need machine learning and AI to spot those anomalies for your team to further investigate.
Mm-hmm. Bonnie.
Just a quick chaser on that one. Something interesting has started to occur, and that is the forensic investigations use of AI to find complex fraud patterns. And this is occurring at a time when governments are, in many countries, are now starting to turn to deferred prosecution agreements, trying to get a deal with the company that is accused of the wrongdoing or the corruption, for example, because it's too complex, will be too lengthy, it would take up too many resources. AI cuts through that, and the security profession is developing to be able to handle this in a cost-effective, timely way. But it's almost as if governments have already given up and are cutting deals that perhaps are not meeting the legal expectations of the public.
So we've got a couple questions. Up there in the corner, I saw a hand raised. Yes, there's someone standing. He's got a microphone, your name and your question. Thank you for contributing.
Thank you. My name is Szebor Box. I'm from Cisco. And by the way, I'm not going to ask question to Prem. Actually, that question would be to Steve. There is a legacy in industry, and the processes that we have in industry right now that being run, they are still something like 40s, 50s. All the nuclear plants actually in UK are being designed by which the blueprint was actually designed in 50s. There are, for example, very first programmable, logic controllers, which are not existing anymore. Now we are talking about this 5G race and how things get connected in IoT. But this long tail of the components which are so old that nobody knows even how they can be, troubleshoot or even fixed. What is your opinion about we as a human race are going to carry on this legacy in the verge of this, revolution which will potentially 5G is going to bring? Thank you.
That's an excellent remark. There's an old joke about a COBOL programmer there, but I won't bother telling it. I think that the point is that we're locked into a lot of these technologies for a long, long while. That's not necessarily a problem in the sense that the technologies still do a good job. In the right environment, they work very well. Where it does become a problem is when you start to mix technologies without taking account of the fact that they are based on different security paradigms. So I go back to what I keep on saying about people, process, technology, and this idea of architecture. And I think when you're running old legacy systems with new technologies, you've got to, I think, to call upon ideas such as architecture to put the right barriers, not necessarily firewalls, that's rather simplistic, but the right barriers, both in terms of components and process, to make sure that the risks are handled correctly. A good example of this is years ago when we started seeing Windows file systems being put on Unix. One of the first systems that did this made a huge error in the implementation. You could get the root account on a Unix system trivially. Root account is God, by the way. This happens because the systems, the people who designed the approach did not really understand some of the fundamental design approaches within the Windows system. So I think it's not a problem. I think we will live with legacy technology for many, many years, but we've got to be clever in the way we deal with it. One last thing here, if I may, because this is critically important. We had this big discussion on sharing information, which I think is really important. Remember, it's only the first step. One of the biggest learning experiences I had as a CISO was that I knew where the vulnerabilities were, but I couldn't patch them because the applications were written to take advantage of the vulnerabilities. So there, you've got to be inventive. Yeah, you've got to put other controls into place to make sure you can't just abandon your application. And that's just fine. I mean, normally you can do this, but you've got to put a lot of thought into it. So my advice to industry would be think very, very careful about this. When running around with iPads and phones and the rest of it and connecting to legacy systems, there's a lot of stuff which would be very difficult to understand. Very last one, if I may. We had a really good network security policy where I was, totally IP-based. And then I found out that what do they call these things? Storage access network was running proprietary protocols and was short-circuiting the firewall. Game over. That's the kind of thing that can happen if you don't really look and understand what's going on in your architecture.
If I may add one sentence, what helps to build the right security architecture is the paradigm called edge computing. Mm-hmm. So actually, with the legacy system, you could put edge devices close to these legacy low computational power devices without possibility of strong authentication mechanisms, encrypting, decrypting, and stuff like that. You put dedicated edge computers, boxes, and they help to leverage the security of the entire system.
That's a very interesting point. So we have about a minute left. As a journalist, I take prerogative in asking at least one uncomfortable question. So to you, Prem, Cisco does a lot of business in China, or at least until recently. And as a lot of folks know, when you do business in China, you put your IP at risk, you put your intellectual property at risk. How in Cisco, as an organization, are you managing that risk of, on the one hand, until somewhat recently, doing a lot of business in China, and on the other hand, defending against adversaries that come from there?
The answer is going to be easy. We don't do much business in China. We actually do very, very little business in China, which, in current situation is advantage for us. Seriously, we used to be good player in China, but over the years, we've been pushed out by some local vendors, and the threat of China is not a big problem for us. In general, sorry for the rounded answer, but we believe in the fair competition. We treat our Chinese competitors in very, very fair way. We take very, very neutral position on what is happening now, geopolitically, and we believe that our products are going to give the value to the customers.
Okay. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time. So please join me in thanking our panel for some great insights today. Thank you guys so much.